Project Management Professional Training Session 5. Planning the project. Congratulations! You have already defined your project as described in Part 1. You can't wait to begin executing. But hold on. I have a couple of questions for you. First, when you are executing your project, how will you know that you are on the right track? Second, during the execution, how will you know that the project is performing in such a way that it will end in success? To address these two and other related questions, you will need to do some planning before you begin executing. Also, to lead the project to success, you want to monitor and control it throughout its lifetime. Planning gives you the tools and the framework to do exactly that. For example, a performance baseline against which you will be measuring the progress of the project, an important part of monitoring and controlling, is developed during planning. This baseline comprises the scope baseline, schedule baseline, and cost baseline, which are developed during scope, schedule, and cost planning, respectively. You will also need to plan for the resources needed to complete the project. Furthermore, any management task has the potential to increase or decrease a potential risk. Therefore, all project management is inherently connected to risk management. You need to plan for managing risks and also quality. Initiation determines what will be done, whereas planning embraces that what, refines it, and determines how it will be done. Planning project and scope. After the project has been initiated, as discussed in the previous chapter, you need to develop a project management plan, which becomes the primary source of information for how the project at hand will be executed, monitored and controlled, and closed. The project plan development involves developing subsidiary plans, of which one important plan is the scope management plan. How important is scope management? If a product is not in the scope, it will not and should not be produced. The primary purpose of project scope management is to ensure that the required work, and only the required work, is performed to complete the project successfully. If changes in the work requirements are made, they must be controlled, that is, the scope must be controlled. Before you start defining the scope, you need to know what the project and product requirements are. In other words, you need to collect requirements based on the needs and expectations of the stakeholders in line with the project objectives. Once you have defined the scope based on these requirements, it needs to be broken down into concrete, manageable tasks that can be assigned and performed. This is accomplished through what is called the Work Breakdown Structure, WBS. In a nutshell, the central issue in this chapter is planning for the project scope. To be able to wrap your mind around this issue, you will explore 3 avenues: developing a project management plan, collecting requirements, and developing the scope baseline. Planning the project, big picture. Once the project has been initiated, it's time to do some planning. This includes determining the project scope, during which time you'll refine the project objectives and determine some how-tos, how the scope will be executed, how the execution will be monitored and controlled, and how the project will be brought to a proper closure. Project planning is embodied in the project management plan, which is developed through progressive elaboration, a concept explained in Chapter 1. The project management plan is a document that defines, prepares, coordinates, and integrates all subsidiary plans, such as scope and risk management plans, into one plan. The goal here is to develop a source of information that will work as a guideline for how the project will be executed, monitored and controlled, and closed. In this section, you will get a bird's-eye view of how different elements of project planning integrate into developing the project management plan. Elements of project planning. Project planning means the following 3 things. Refining the project objectives defined during project initiation and collecting requirements based on the stakeholder needs and expectations. Determining the scope of the project. Determining the course of action required to attain these objectives, which involves breaking down the scope and objectives into concrete, manageable tasks. It is important to plan the project because not all projects need all the planning processes, nor do they all need them to the same degree. Therefore, the content of the project management plan, the ultimate document developed from project planning, will depend upon a specific project. As the project goes through different stages, the project management plan may be updated and revised through the change control process. The following is an incomplete list of issues that project planning addresses. Which project management processes will be used for the project? What will the level of implementation for each of the processes be? And what are the inputs and tools and techniques used for the processes? The project baseline against which the performance of the project will be measured and against which the project will be monitored and controlled. How the changes to the approved plan will be monitored and controlled. What the needs and techniques for communication among the stakeholders are. How the project lifecycle looks, including the project phases if the project is a multi-phase one. Note the project baseline is defined as the approved plan for the scope, schedule, and cost of the project. The project performance is measured against this baseline, and therefore this baseline is also called the performance baseline. The project baseline is also referred to in terms of its components: cost baseline, schedule baseline, and scope baseline. How do you know how the project is performing? You compare the performance to the baseline. Approved changes in scope, schedule, or cost will obviously change the baseline. Figure 4.1 presents the big picture of project planning and its relationship with executing. This figure and other figures like this only present a high-level view. The details may be more complex. For example, the project management plan is initially an input to execution but can be influenced and changed as a result of execution. Depending upon the complexity of the project management plan can be either a summary or a collection of subsidiary plans and components, which might include the following. Standard plans from different aspects of project planning, such as the cost management plan, communication management plan, scope management plan, and risk management plan. Other components, such as the milestones list, the resource calendar, and baselines for scope, schedule, cost, and quality. A baseline is a reference plan against which all the performance deviations are measured. This reference plan can be the original or the updated plan. In a nutshell, project planning involves determining exactly what will be done and how it will be done. Executing a project means implementing the project management plan for that project. Therefore, the project management plan contains the project scope that defines what needs to be done to meet the project objectives. But how is the project management plan actually developed? Planning scope, big picture. The project scope is defined as the work that must be performed to deliver a product with a given scope. The product scope is the set of functions and features that characterize a product to be delivered by the project. The scope, i.e. product scope and project scope, refers to both what is included in the project and what is not. In other words, scoping a project means drawing boundaries around it. The importance of managing the project scope cannot be overemphasized, because it has a profound impact on the overall success of the project. Caution: by project scope we usually mean the project product scope and the scope of the work required to produce that product. However, keep in mind that in PMBOK the project scope only refers to the work required to deliver the product and does not include product scope. Study checkpoint 4.1. Among the following attributes, identify which are part of product scope and which are part of the project scope, according to PMBOK, 6th edition. A. Develop software modules to support website. B. The user can only access this website after logging in. C. The drug should not have more than 2 side effects. D. The drug must be developed within 1 year. E. The drug must be tested in-house before it goes to Food and Drug Administration. Although we are covering only the planning part of scope management, it's a good idea to keep the big picture in mind, which is presented in Figure 4.1. As said earlier, the major goal of scope management is to ensure that the required work and only the required work is included and performed in the project. As shown in Figure 4.2, this goal is accomplished by the following processes of scope management. Plan scope management. This process is performed to develop a document called the Scope Management Plan, which contains information on how to define, control, and validate the scope, i.e., the project and product scope. Collect requirements. This is the process performed to collect, determine, and document the project and product requirements and plan to manage those requirements. Define scope. This process is performed to develop a detailed description of the project and the product in the sense of what is included and what is not. Create work breakdown structure. WBS. This process is used to develop the work breakdown structure in which deliverables, and hence work to produce them, are broken down into smaller manageable tasks that can be assigned to team members. This is done starting with the scope. Validate scope. This is the process used to formalize the acceptance of the completed and already verified project deliverables. Control scope, used to monitor the status of the scope, i.e., project scope and product scope, and to manage changes to the scope baseline. Accept, control scope and validate scope. All scope management processes are discussed in detail in this chapter. But, before we focus on scope management, we will discuss how the project management plan is developed. Developing the project management plan. Congratulations! You have already gotten your project defined and initiated with the project charter. You can't wait to begin executing. But hold on. I have 3 questions for you. First, how do you know what exactly to execute and how? Second, when you are executing your project, how will you know that you are on the right track? Third, during the execution, how will you know that the project is performing in such a way that it will end with success? To address these 3 and other related questions, you will need to do some planning before you begin the execution. So, once the project has been initiated, it is time to do some planning. Project planning starts with the process of develop project management plan, which defines, prepares, coordinates, and integrates all subsidiary plans, such as the scope and risk management plans, into one plan called the project management plan. Most of the subsidiary plans are prepared as part of other processes. One of the goals here is to develop a source of information that will work as a guideline for how the project will be planned, executed, monitored and controlled, and closed. Note the Develop Project Management Plan process belongs to the Project Integration Knowledge area. One reason why it is important to develop a project management plan is that not all projects need all the planning processes or need them to the same degree. Depending upon the complexity of the project management plan can be either a summary or a collection of subsidiary plans and components. One necessary item in the plan is the baseline for at least the following project features: scope, time, and cost. A baseline is a reference against which all the performance deviations are measured. Note the project management plan provides the basis of all the needed project work and how it will be performed. The process of developing the project management plan, presented in Table 4.2 in terms of input, tools and techniques, and output, falls in the knowledge area of integration management because it coordinates the various planning processes and activities. Therefore, output from other planning processes, in addition to the project charter, are the obvious inputs to this process. The other inputs are enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. You take the relevant information from the project charter and elaborate that. The outputs from other planning processes refer to the subsidiary plans, such as cost or quality management plans. We will cover these processes and plans in other chapters. You have to deal with enterprise environmental factors, such as using the existing facilities and working within the given organizational structure and governance framework, following the industry standards, and meeting the legal and regulatory requirements. Similarly, you must work with the relevant organizational process assets, using the organizational standard policies, processes, and procedures, plan management templates, and knowledge databases. To develop the project management plan, you apply expert judgment, data gathering, meetings, and interpersonal and team skills as tools and techniques. Expert judgment may be sought in the areas relevant to developing the project management plan, such as tailoring the project management process to the project needs, elaborating on high-level information from the project, and developing technical details to be included in the project management plan. Data gathering techniques used here include interviews, focus groups, brainstorming, and checklists. A checklist in this case would be a list of items or information to be included in the project management plan. While developing the plan, you check against the list to verify that each item in the list has been included. Other data gathering tools mentioned, which were explained in the development of the project charter, may be used here in the context of project management. The interpersonal and team skills are also the same as explained in the section on developing the project charter: conflict management, facilitation, and meeting management. By applying these tools and techniques to the input, you produce the output of the developed project management plan process, which is, well, the project management plan. Plans and baselines of a typical project management plan are listed in Table 4.3 with the chapter numbers where they are discussed in detail. Depending on the project's needs, additional plans and other components may be developed and included in the project management plan, such as a change management plan and a configuration management plan. Caution: some documents, which are not included in the project plan, are produced and used at different times throughout the project lifecycle. They are simply called project documents. Now that the project management plan is in place, we turn our attention to scope management. But before we can manage the scope, we need to develop the scope management plan. Developing the project scope management plan. Before starting to perform the 5 scope management processes, you must develop the scope management plan, a blueprint that will show how to develop, control, and validate the scope. As mentioned previously, this plan is developed by using the plan scope management process, presented in Table 4.4 in terms of input, tools and techniques, and output. You must develop this plan in the context of the purpose of the project documented in the project charter, which is where you will also find a high-level project description and high-level requirements, along with other relevant information, such as assumptions and constraints. Also, you will need a project management plan for the quality management plan, details of the project lifecycle, and development approach to develop it. All 3 will impact how you plan the scope management. Development approach refers to the development approach or approaches adapted for this project, such as Agile, Waterfall, and Iterative. The plan scope management process will also be influenced by EEFs like personnel administration, culture, and infrastructure of the organization, along with marketing conditions. Of course, speaking of OPAs, this plan will be developed by following the organizational policies and procedures, and you will make use of historical information, including lessons learned from past projects. As for tools, in the process of developing the scope management plan, you will use expert judgment on relevant topics and meetings with the appropriate stakeholders, such as the project sponsor and some project team members. We also want to explore various techniques that can be used to collect requirements, define an elaborate scope from the requirements, and validate the scope on the finished product, the alternative analysis. Of course, other data analysis methods could also be considered to accomplish the same goal. As a result of applying these tools on the input, we get a scope management plan and a requirement management plan, described next. Requirement management plan and scope management plan. The requirement management plan basically describes the collect requirements process, how to collect, determine, and document the project and product requirements and how you plan to manage those requirements. It addresses questions like the following. How should requirements be prioritized? What kind of metrics will be used and why? How will requirement-related activities be planned, tracked, and reported? How will the changes be traced, initiated, tracked, and their impact be analyzed? Similarly, the scope management plan describes the how-to details regarding the rest of the scope management processes, define scope, create work breakdown structure, control scope, and validate scope. Before you can actually define and develop the scope, you need to have a very crucial item in place, stakeholder requirements, which form the basis of scope. Caution! It's important to realize that product scope and project scope are not independent. Product scope is the set of functions and features that fully define the product, and project scope is the work required to deliver the product. So, the product scope more or less determines the project scope. The project scope management plan and requirement management plan become part of the project management plan. Collecting requirements for the project. Project success is defined as the delivery of the planned outcome with full scope, on time, and within the schedule. To realize this success, it's very important that there is agreement on what exactly is being delivered and with what requirements. A requirement is a condition, characteristic, or capability that a specific outcome of the project must have. For example, an online banking website is an outcome of the project, and the condition that it must record the number of users that visited the site each day is a requirement, as is the fact that the user login must be secure. Requirements may come from different sources, such as from standards, specifications, and contracts. Stakeholder expectations and needs within the context of project objectives materialize into requirements. Note: generally speaking, project requirements should include the product requirements. However, many organizations distinguish between project requirements and product requirements, in which case project requirements include strictly project-related requirements, such as schedule and delivery requirements, business-related requirements, and other project management requirements, whereas product requirements include the product-related requirements, such as those related to product performance, security, and defects. You need to do some requirements planning, which includes the following. Defining and documenting the project requirements. Defining and documenting the product requirements. Managing the requirements throughout the project. Tip: how effective you are in capturing requirements will determine how effective you are in getting agreement on these requirements from the stakeholders and in managing the stakeholders' expectations and needs. Also, these requirements go right into the foundations of the WBS, along with the deliverables. Therefore, collecting requirements effectively is critical for the success of the project. You collect requirements by using the Collect Requirements process, illustrated in Table 4.5 in terms of input, tools and techniques, and output. Input includes all the relevant documents, i.e., plans and project documents and business documents, where you can get all the high-level information regarding the project and product requirements. Based on the information provided so far in this book, you can easily guess that these documents are 1. Business document, business case. 2. Project charter. 3. Agreements. 4. Plan documents, requirement management plan and scope management plan, covered in the previous section, and the stakeholder engagement plan, which will be useful in managing the requirements. 5. Project document, assumptions log for assumptions about project, product, stakeholders, etc. The lessons learned register for information on which requirement collection techniques have been effective so far, and the stakeholder register, which provides information about stakeholders and their requirements. The stakeholder register was discussed in Chapter 3 and the stakeholder management plan will be covered in Chapter 8. Of course, there are some EEFs and OPAs that influence the requirement collection process. This is left as an exercise for you in Study Checkpoint 4.2. Just ask what factors and assets can be the source of requirements or can help you reach them. Study Checkpoint 4.2. Make lists of enterprise environment factors and organizational process assets that can influence the collect requirements process. So, these input items provide us with the high-level requirements and high-level project and product information from which requirements may be drawn. Next, we need to analyze these requirements and information by using some tools and techniques to collect the requirements so as to do the following. 1. Extract the final refined set of requirements. 2. Manage them. Tools and techniques for collecting requirements. You collect the requirement-related data, present it, analyze, and make decisions about requirements or tools. You perform these tasks by using some techniques. If you need help with these techniques, you can always use tools of expert judgment. Other techniques and methods are presented in the following paragraphs. Data gathering techniques. The following are some examples of data gathering techniques that can be used depending on the project need. Observations and conversation. Observation is a technique in which the requirements for a product or project process are gathered by directly observing the user using the product or performing the process. In other words, the process or product is observed in action in the real world with people on the job. For that reason, this technique is also called job shadowing. Depending on the situation, the observer can simply observe the user doing the job or can participate in it. Of course, conversation and articulation skills will matter here. Interviews, questionnaires, and surveys. An interview is typically performed by asking predetermined and on-the-spot questions and recording the responses. Depending on the situation, interviews may take several forms, such as one-on-one, multiple interviewees, or multiple interviewers. For example, by interviewing subject matter experts and individuals who ran similar projects before, you may identify and define some features and functions of the project deliverables. When you want to cover a large number of respondents quickly, questionnaires and surveys will be more appropriate. These are based on a written set of questions. Focus groups and facilitated workshops. A focus group is a set of pre-qualified stakeholders and subject matter experts that are brought together with the purpose of learning about their opinions, expectations, and attitudes about a product, service, or result that will be the output of the project. Generally speaking, a moderator facilitates the interactive discussion to make this experience more conversational than one-on-one interviews. A facilitated workshop is a session that brings together cross-functional stakeholders to focus on defining product requirements. It generally proves to be an effective technique for quickly defining cross-functional requirements and reconciling differences among the stakeholders regarding the requirements. These workshops also help with developing trust and improving communication among the stakeholders and therefore fostering relationships that could help the project succeed. Benchmarking. Benchmarking is comparing practices, products, or services of a project with those of some reference projects for the purpose of learning, improving, and creating the basis for measuring performance. We will learn more about quality management in Chapter 7. Brainstorming. This is a creative technique generally used in a group environment to gather ideas as candidates for a solution to a problem or an issue without any immediate evaluation of these ideas. The evaluation and analysis of these ideas happens later. Obviously, this technique can also be used to collect requirements. Data presentation and analysis techniques. When you have requirement-related data, it needs to be presented for review and analysis. Various data presentation techniques may be used, some of which will be discussed next. Affinity diagram. This is a technique in which a large number of ideas or data are classified into different groups by using some criteria. Then, the relationships among these ideas are explored. This facilitates an effective and efficient review and analysis. Idea/mind mapping. This is a visual technique in which various ideas, such as those collected through brainstorming, are mapped around a central or key concept to expose commonalities and differences among them. In this way, one can understand the existing ideas better, consolidate them, and generate new ideas. Mapping also helps classify ideas into groups by discovering relationships among them. In addition to project management, this technique is also used in other areas, such as personal, family, and education. It helps with summarizing, clarifying, and revising ideas. Nominal group technique. This technique combines brainstorming with discussion and ranking ideas by voting or scoring. Here are the steps. 1. For a given problem, a group member creates her/his own ideas in private. 2. A moderator presents all ideas in one place to the group. 3. All presented ideas are discussed to better understand them. 4. Each member scores each idea privately on a scale, example, from 1 to 5. Higher ranking ideas can be processed again through these steps. At the end, the best ranked idea or ideas are selected. These techniques can be used to prioritize the requirements. Also, different data analysis techniques can be used, such as document analysis, which involves accessing the relevant documents, studying them, and extracting the relevant information, in this case the requirements, from them. In this process, the relevant document is any document with requirement-related information, such as product marketing materials, agreements, business plans, and requests for proposals. Prototyping. A prototype is a working model of a product put together without developing the actual product, such as a small-scale or toy product, mock-ups, computer-generated models, and computer simulations, example, a Monte Carlo simulation. Organizations usually make prototypes when developing a proof of concept. Prototypes can also be used to collect requirements by experimenting with the prototype and letting stakeholders experiment with it and offer feedback. It's more tangible than the abstract idea of a product. Prototypes can be improved and modified based on the feedback from the stakeholders. In this way, prototypes support the progressive elaboration process of developing requirements. Context diagrams. A context diagram is a very useful tool for determining the requirements of a product, as it presents the product scope visually by showing how the business system is used. In other words, a typical context diagram shows two kinds of components: parts of the system that users can access, and users, also called actors. Actors play two kinds of roles, entering the input into the system and receiving the output from the system. One actor can play one or both roles. Figure 4.3 presents a very simple example of a context diagram of an online learning system, where arrow direction shows which way the information flows. Study checkpoint 4.3. Assuming that the online learning system in Figure 4.3 is managed by a company with its own teachers. Q1. Name internal actors. Q2. Name external actors. Decision-making techniques. Decision-making is, in general, a process used to collectively assess and evaluate multiple alternatives in terms of expected outcomes. The decision usually results in taking specific action. In this process, you will need to make decisions, example, identify/generate, classify, and prioritize project and product requirements. There are multiple methods available to make decisions that were discussed in Chapter 3. Interpersonal and team skills. In applying the data collection techniques, interpersonal and team skills will be needed, such as conversational and articulation skills, running facilitation works, and using nominal group techniques. All these techniques are discussed in the sections on data gathering, presentation, and analysis. You use one or more of these techniques on the input to generate the output of the collect requirements process. Output of collecting requirements. During this process of collecting the requirements, you will produce two documents, the stakeholder requirements document and the requirements management plan. Requirements documentation. This documentation consists of a list of requirements and any necessary details for each item in the list. The details of the requirements and the format of the document depend on the project and the rules within the performing organization. The following are some essential elements of the requirements document. For effective management, you can organize the requirements into different categories, as follows. Business requirements. It describes the business-related need for which the process was started, example, the overall purpose of the project, such as the opportunity being seized or the business problem being solved. Project requirements. These are about the project-related processes, needs, and conditions, such as milestone data and other conditions in the contract. Solution requirements. These are of two types. 1. Functional requirements, referring to the functionality of the project outcome, example, what the product does, its feature. And 2. Non-functional requirements, such as compliance, compatibility, support, reliability, safety, and performance. Stakeholder requirements are based on the needs of all or part of the stakeholders. Quality requirements, such as not allowing more than 3 bugs per software module. Support and training requirements, such as that the product will be released with manual. Impacts of the requirements. This element describes the impact of requirements on the project and on entities external to the project, such as different groups in the organization. Some requirements will start out vague due to a lack of detailed information, but will progressively become more well-defined as more detailed information becomes available. Caution! The final version of each requirement must be well-defined and not vague. As a test, always ask this question: how will I be able to measure or test it? Only then can it be used for baselining. Also, make sure that a requirement is consistent within itself and with other requirements. Requirements are usually traced and tracked by using a tool called the Requirements Traceability Matrix. Requirements Traceability Matrix, as the name suggests, the Requirements Traceability Matrix is a table that traces each requirement back to its origin, such as product or business objective, and tracks its progress throughout the project's life. Linking a requirement to the business objective underlines its value. Tracking the requirement throughout the lifecycle of the project ensures that it will be delivered before the project is completed. So, this table becomes a very useful tool to remind the team how important these requirements are, when they are going to be implemented, and how we are progressing in implementing them. The Requirements Traceability Matrix links each requirement to, for example, business need, opportunity, and objective. Project objectives and deliverables. The project scope and the product scope and deliverable. Product design, development, and testing, and, for high-level requirements, to their details. Key information about a requirement can be stored in the form of its attributes. Here are some examples of attributes of a requirement: a unique identifier, description, owner, source, priority, status, and completion date. The requirements become the basis on which you develop the scope. Defining the project scope. The project charter is developed during the initiation stage of the project. As you move to the planning stage, during the development of the scope management plan and requirement document, also called the requirement documentation, you have enough information about the project and the product to start defining the project scope. Note, when we say scope or project scope, it generally includes both the scope of the project and the scope of the product that it will deliver unless stated otherwise. The scope is defined by using the defined scope process presented in Table 4.6. Input to scope definition. The purpose of the defined scope process is to figure out the detailed descriptions of the project and its product. Therefore, the following documents will be the obvious input to this process. Project charter. This is needed for high-level project and product descriptions and approval requirements. Scope management plan. This is needed for information on how the scope will be defined. Project documents. These include requirement documentation, assumptions log, and risk register. Here are some examples of the organizational process assets that can be helpful in defining the scope. Template for project scope statement. Scope-related project files from previous projects. Lessons learned from previous projects or from the previous phases of this project. Policies and procedures relevant to defining the project scope. This process will be influenced by almost the same enterprise environment factors as in the case of the collect requirements process. Tip: it's critical to the success of the project that you determine the scope correctly, only the required features and functions for the product and only the required work to produce those features and functions, nothing less. nothing more. Once you have input for the scope definition, you apply the tools and techniques discussed next to define, or redefine, the project scope. Once you have input for the scope definition, you apply the tools and techniques discussed next to define, or redefine, the project scope. Tools and techniques for scope definition. This section will discuss the tools and techniques used in the scope definition process. Expert judgment. You can use help from relevant experts in the organization to develop parts of the detailed project scope. Product analysis. To hammer out the details of the product scope, you might need to perform product analysis, which might include techniques such as product breakdown, requirement analysis, system engineering, value analysis, and value engineering. The goal is to translate the project objectives to tangible deliverables that meet the requirements. Each application area has different product analysis methods to accomplish this. Data analysis. Scope includes both product description and the kind of project work needed to deliver that product. Analysis is performed to find the best approaches to defining and performing project work. One such analysis technique is alternative analysis, which can be used to evaluate the different methods for implementing the requirements to help one pick the best method. Decision-making techniques. One or more of these techniques, described in Chapter 3, such as multi-criteria, can be used to set the criteria for requirements, schedule, cost, resources, etc. The goal here would be to explore and refine the scope. Interpersonal and team skills. Of course, in the business of project management, you often use these skills. In this process, for example, you would use facilitation skills in facilitated workshops with stakeholders. You apply these tools or techniques to the input to hammer out the output of the scope definition process. Output of scope definition. Depending on the input, the scope definition process can generate two kinds of output: the project scope statement, which contains the original scope definition, and approved updates to some project documents. Recall that the project scope statement is a component of the baseline used to manage change requests to the project. Caution: the project scope statement contains both the project scope and project product scope. Project scope statement. The key output item of the defined scope process is the project scope statement, which includes the project scope as well as the product scope. It basically describes what needs to be accomplished by the product and work to generate the product. It provides a documented basis for the following: developing a common understanding among the stakeholders about the project scope, doing detailed planning, creating WBS. The specific elements that may be included in the project scope statement are discussed in the following list. Product scope description. Product scope is defined as the description of features, functions, and other characteristics of a project product. Product acceptance criteria. This defines the process, criteria, and conditions for accepting the completed products that the project will deliver. Project assumptions and constraints. Assumptions and constraints are initially included in the project charter. However, at this stage, you have more information about the project and therefore can revisit the initial assumptions and constraints. You might be able to identify more assumptions and constraints. You should document the specific assumptions related to the project scope and also analyze their impact in case they turn out to be false. Due to the uncertainty built into them, assumptions are potential sources of risk. The constraints related to the project scope must also be documented in the scope statement. Because the constraints limit the team's options, the constraints' impact on the project must be evaluated. The constraints can come from various sources, such as a predetermined deadline, also called a hard deadline, for the completion of the project, or a milestone, limits on the funds available for the project, and contractual provisions. Project deliverables. A deliverable is a unique and verifiable project outcome, such as a product, a capability to provide a service, or a result. It may be required to be produced to complete a project, a process, or a phase of the project. The deliverables may also include related material, such as manuals and other documentation. The scope statement provides the list of deliverables and their descriptions. Project exclusions. This involves drawing boundaries around the project by specifying what is included and what is not, especially focusing on the gray areas where the stakeholders may make their own assumptions, different from each other. It generally identifies what is excluded from the project, which helps to manage stakeholder expectations. You must be able to make a distinction between objectives, deliverables, and requirements. For example, in a project to launch a website, the website is a deliverable. That the website must print a warning message at the login time is a requirement, and that the website should increase the company revenue by 3% is an objective. The project scope statement serves the following purposes. It serves as a component of the baseline that will be used to evaluate whether the request for a change or additional work falls within or beyond the scope of the project, hence, helps with avoiding scope creep. In general, it helps with making project decisions throughout the lifecycle of the project. By providing a common understanding of the project scope, the scope statement helps bring stakeholders onto the same page in their expectations. Because the scope statement describes the deliverables and the work required to create those deliverables, it is used to create a WBS, which helps in scheduling the project. It serves as a guide for the project team to do more detailed planning. As a result of this process, some documents would need to be updated. Project document updates. In the process of defining the project scope, you may end up modifying the existing requirements or adding new requirements. You may also learn more about the stakeholders. Also, some assumptions may no longer be true. Accordingly, the documents that may be updated as a result of defining the scope include the following: requirement documentation, requirement traceability matrix, stakeholder register, assumptions log, stakeholder register. In a nutshell, the project scope statement outlines the scope of the project in terms of the project outcome specified by its characteristics and the way it would be produced and delivered by the project. From the perspective of actually performing the work, the scope statement is still a high-level document. To be able to schedule the project, identify and assign resources, and manage the project successfully, these deliverables need to be broken down into manageable tasks. This is accomplished by creating an entity called the Work Breakdown Structure, WBS. Caution: in defining scope, we don't use all the requirements that were collected. Instead, we consider only those that made it to the requirement documentation after analysis. Creating a Work Breakdown Structure, WBS. What is the secret behind accomplishing seemingly impossible tasks in any field? The answer is to break down the required work into smaller, manageable pieces. This is also a very important process in project management. To be able to actually execute the project scope is broken down into manageable tasks, thereby creating a work breakdown structure, WBS. In other words, a WBS is a deliverable-oriented hierarchy of the work that must be performed to accomplish the objectives of and create the deliverables for the project. Table 4.7 shows the input, tools and techniques, and output of creating the WBS. The project scope statement contains the list of deliverables and product description. The requirement documentation describes the product and project requirements. Information in these two items provides the basis for creating the WBS, and scope management tells us the hows of developing the WBS. You should always consider organizational process assets while going through this and several other processes. You can, for almost any process, close your eyes and see the relevant organizational policies and procedures, templates, project files, and lessons learned from previous projects. In this case, relevant means related to the WBS. Depending on the application field or specific industry of your project, there may be industry-wide standards for creating a WBS. That standard is an example of an EEF for this process. You can always make use of expert judgment on topics relevant to the process, but the main technique that you will need to create the WBS is decomposition. Decomposition is a technique for subdividing the project deliverables into smaller, manageable tasks called work packages. The WBS is a hierarchical structure of an inverted tree, with work packages at the lowest level of each branch, the leaves. A level can be broken down into sublevels. The depth or height of the tree or decomposition depends on the size and complexity of the project. Different deliverables may have different levels of decomposition, as shown in Figure 4.4. A simple example of a WBS, where the lines are called branches and the boxes are called nodes or packages. The lowest packages are called work packages. You decompose the scope by executing the following steps. 1. Identify the deliverables and the work involved by analyzing the project scope statement and requirement documentation. 2. Understand the relationships among the deliverables. 3. Structure and organize the first level, just below the root of the hierarchical tree, of the WBS hierarchy. Based on the project at hand, you can use one of the following approaches: use the deliverables as the components in the first level or use the phases of the project as the components in the first level. 4. Decompose the upper level into more detailed components for the lower level. 5. Keep decomposing to lower levels until necessary and sufficient decomposition has been achieved. 6. Assign identification codes to the WBS components. As the work is decomposed to lower levels of detail, work components become more concrete and manageable. However, you should avoid excessive decomposition because it will lead to a large number of work packages, and it will not be possible to manage all of them effectively. In other words, excessive decomposition leads to inefficient use of management and other resources. Necessary and sufficient decomposition is the key. Tip: during decomposition, the components are defined in terms of how the project work will actually be executed and controlled. You must verify the correctness of the decomposition at each level by requiring that the lower-level components are necessary and sufficient to the completion of the corresponding higher-level deliverables. One final point: while using the technique of decomposition, remember a useful concept or trick: rolling wave planning. It's a fancy term that refers to handling a deliverable or its subcomponent that cannot be decomposed further currently because we don't know the details about it yet. For example, it is to be executed far in the future. We leave the decomposition of such a deliverable at a level allowed by the available information and wait for further decomposition until more information becomes available. Yes, it is an example of progressive elaboration. The WBS document is the key output item of the Create WBS process, but there are some other output items as well. Output of creating WBS. During the Create WBS process, and when putting together the scope baseline, which is the main output of this process, we may discover that the content of some documents need to be updated, e.g. assumptions and constraints in the assumptions log or requirements in the requirement documentation. Scope baseline. The main output of the Create WBS process, the scope baseline, consists of the project scope statement, the WBS, and the WBS dictionary. These components of the scope baseline are discussed next. Project scope statement. This document includes project and product scope descriptions, project deliverables, product acceptance criteria, and project assumptions and constraints. Work breakdown structure. As explained earlier, the WBS is a deliverable-oriented hierarchical structure that decomposes the project scope and deliverables into the work packages that will be executed by the project team to create the planned deliverables, and in this way accomplish the planned project objectives. The project manager creates this document with the help of the project team. Work packages and control account. Remember, at the lowest part of each branch in the WBS, we have work packages, with each work package assigned a unique identifier. To this identifier is attached information about schedule, resources, and cost for this work package, and it acts as a code of account. In other words, each work package represents a deliverable or a component of it, with schedule, resources, and cost attached. Using one or more such points or codes of account, information on schedule, resources, and cost for a group of work packages can be summed or integrated and managed. This way, each package control point becomes a part of what is called the control account for that group of work packages. A control account represents a control management point where scope, schedule, and cost are integrated for the purpose of monitoring and controlling the performance. Example, comparing with earned value. Caution: a control account may contain one or more work packages, but a work package can have membership in only one control account. This means that a control account is in some package above the work packages and contains all the work packages below it in the branch to which it belongs. A control account may include as one or more planning packages. Planning package. This is a WBS component or package used for planning one or more work packages. Obviously, it should be below the control account package to which it belongs and above the work packages that it's going to plan. WBS dictionary. This is a supporting document for the main WBS document to provide details about the components of the WBS. The details about a component might include elements such as a code of account identifier, description of work involved, quality requirements, acceptance criteria, list of milestones, schedule, cost estimates, required resources, contract information, if any, and the organization or group responsible for this component. Tip: as you can guess, most of the information in the WBS dictionary is generated by other processes. Note: do not confuse the WBS with other information breakdown structures, such as the Organizational Breakdown Structure, OBS, which provides a hierarchy of the performing organization and can be used to identify organizational units for assigning the WBS work packages. Remember, the end goal of the WBS is to specify the project scope in terms of work packages. This is what distinguishes the WBS from other information breakdown structures. Caution: the PMP exam expects you to know the ropes around the formal standard terminology. For example, if I say project plan, you should be able to figure out that I'm referring to project management plan. Another example, if I say defining scope, you should be able to translate it to the defined scope process, the same way you will translate the planning stage to the planning process group. Study checkpoint 4.5. Q1. What is the difference between management control point and control account? Q2. What is the difference between control account and code of account? The mantra before developing the WBS is, if it's not in the WBS, it will not be done. The mantra after developing the WBS should be, if it's not in the scope baseline, it will not be done. The approved version of the scope baseline becomes a component of the project management plan and can be changed only through the formal change control procedure, i.e., running the processes. It plays a crucial role in determining many aspects of the project, such as schedule, cost, quality, and procurement. In other words, it's very important that the scope is monitored and controlled, which we will learn about in the monitoring and controlling part of the book. Project Management Common Sense. By now, you must have noticed some of the common inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs. Let's make them common sense for project management. Enterprise Environmental Factors and Organizational Process Assets. The Enterprise Environmental Factors, EEFs, and Organizational Process Assets, OPAs, are very common inputs to the processes. If you master the EEFs and OPAs discussed in Chapter 2 and applied in the previous and current chapters, then by knowing the definition of a process, you should be able to figure out what EEFs and OPAs the process would need as input to help produce the output. Also note that sometimes OPAs are needed because they need to be updated as part of the process output. Project documents. The same is true for project documents. If you know the names of most of the project documents and what they contain, then by knowing the definition of a process, you should be able to tell what project documents the process would need as input. Again, a process may need a document to help produce output, including the case where the output item is to update the document. Expert judgment and meetings. There are many tools and techniques in common for many processes. Knowing what the process is supposed to do reveals the topics involved, and those are the topics you may possibly need expert judgment on. Similarly, by knowing the project topics and activities, it will become obvious to you what kinds of meetings you will be holding during the process. General rules of good meeting management remain the same. Example, timely invitations to appropriate stakeholders, running the meeting by the agenda, starting and finishing on time, and follow-up action. So, the coverage of these common inputs, tools and techniques, and output items in the upcoming chapters will assume that you have developed the skills just described. Tip: although the standard project processes are the same for each organization, the details and manners in which they are implemented might be different for different organizations. Each organization can develop its own implementation details, which consist of items, such as detailed steps for how to carry on the project processes, templates, meetings, and procedures. The three most important takeaways from this chapter are as follows. 1. All subsidiary project management plans, baselines, and some other documents are integrated into one plan called the Project Management Plan. 2. Requirements are the basis on which we develop the scope that leads to the WBS, the work required, which requires a schedule and determines cost. In that way, requirements play a crucial role in determining the schedule, cost, quality, and procurement. 3. The project scope statement consists of both project scope and product scope. The WBS dictionary, and project scope statement constitute the scope baseline, an output of the Create WBS process. The actual work results are compared against the scope baseline to measure project progress. Summary. After a project has been initiated, the project management plan is developed to specify how the project at hand will be executed, monitored and controlled, and closed. The project management plan can contain subsidiary plans, such as a quality management plan, a risk management plan, a project scope management plan, and a scope baseline. Using documents such as the project charter and quality management plan, we develop the scope management plan and requirement management plan, which tell us how to develop, control, and validate the scope of the project and product, called scope or sometimes project scope. Based on the scope management plan and requirement management plan, we use the collect requirements process to collect project and product requirements and put them into requirement documentation, and we also create a requirement traceability matrix to monitor the requirements by linking them to project objectives, deliverables, status, and so forth. This requirement documentation is used for the rest of the scope processes, a reflection of the fact that requirements directly or indirectly affect multiple project aspects, including scope, schedule, cost, risk, and procurement. With requirement documentation in hand, and by using the defined scope process, we develop the project scope statement, a document that consists of both project scope and product scope. The project scope statement, along with the requirement documentation, is used to create the WBS, a hierarchical structure in which the project scope is broken down into manageable tasks, which can be assigned to team members. The process Create WBS also creates the WBS dictionary, which offers details for the WBS components, such as schedule milestones, cost estimate, and quality requirements. The WBS dictionary, and project scope statement constitute the scope baseline, an output of the Create WBS process, against which the actual work results are compared. Road ahead. Now that you have the project scope, i.e., project and product scopes, figured out, you are one step closer to starting project execution. Before we start project execution, however, we will need to develop a schedule for it. We will show how to plan scheduling in the next chapter. Exams I view. Comprehend. The scope management plan developed from the project charter is the blueprint that will show how to develop, control, and validate the scope. The stakeholder register generated by the Identify Stakeholders process is an input item to collecting requirements, and so is the project charter. The requirement documentation generated by the Collect Requirements process is an input to defining the project scope. The project charter and the requirement documentation are input items to the Define Scope process that is used to develop the project scope statement. The project scope statement and requirement documentation are input items to creating the WBS. The scope baseline consists of the project scope statement, WBS, and WBS dictionary and is generated by the Create WBS process. Requirements, both themselves and those surfaced through the project scope statement, WBS, and WBS dictionary, i.e., the scope baseline, affect almost all the important aspects of a project, such as schedule, resources, cost, quality, procurement, and risk. Look out. Do not confuse project scope with product scope. The product scope consists of the features and functions that characterize a product to be delivered by the project, whereas the project scope is composed of the work that must be performed, and only that work, to deliver products with specified features. The project scope statement contains both the project scope and the project product scope. The scope statement, the WBS document, and the WBS dictionary combined constitute the scope baseline against which the actual work results are compared. Memorize. All subsidiary project management plans, baselines, and some other documents are integrated into one plan called the project management plan. The rest of the documents used in a project are simply called project documents. Most of the information in the WBS dictionary is generated by other processes and not by the Create WBS process. Control accounts are the points in the WBS at which scope, schedule, and cost are integrated for the purpose of monitoring and controlling the performance. The plan scope management process generates two plans, the scope management plan and the requirement management plan. Review questions. 1. Which of the following is a false statement about the WBS? A. A control account may have many code of account identifiers. B. You should keep decomposing WBS components to lower levels until necessary and sufficient decomposition has been achieved. C. Each work component appears in the WBS once and only once. D. The work packages should appear from left to right in the order in which the work will be performed. 2. Which of the following is done first? A. Creating the scope statement. B. Creating the WBS. C. Creating the requirement documentation. D. Creating the project charter. 3. The WBS is the output of which of the following processes? A. Create WBS process. B. Define scope process. C. Develop WBS process. D. Project initiating process. 4. The project scope statement is the output of which of the following processes? A. Create WBS process. B. Define scope process. C. Create project scope process. D. Project initiating process. 5. Which of the following is a false statement about the output of the plan scope management process that creates the project scope management plan? A. It describes how to verify the project scope. B. It describes how to control the project scope. C. It doesn't describe how to manage the requirements. D. It describes how to define the product scope. 6. What are the components in the lowest level of the WBS hierarchy collectively called? A. Work packages. B. Control accounts. C. Phase. D. Milestones. 7. Choose what is included in the project scope statement. A. Project scope. B. Product scope. C. Assumptions and constraints. D. Some things that the project is not going to do. 8. Which one of the following constitutes the project scope baseline? A. The WBS document and the scope statement. B. The scope statement. C. The WBS document. D. The WBS dictionary, and the scope statement. 9. Who creates the WBS? A. The project manager alone. B. The upper management in the performing organization. C. The customer. D. The project manager, with help from the project team. 10. Which of the following is not included in the project scope statement? A. Project assumptions and constraints. B. The WBS. C. Product description. D. Project deliverables. 11. You are in the process of developing the requirement management plan for your project. You will develop this plan. A. By performing the develop requirement plan process. B. By performing the plan scope management process. C. There is no process for it. D. During the initiation stage of the project. 12. You are in the planning stage of a project. Walking down the hallway, your supervisor mumbles, "Don't forget job shadowing." Job shadowing is a technique used in A. Defining the project scope. B. Collecting product requirements. C. Creating the WBS. D. Developing the stakeholder management strategy. 13. You are planning the scope for your project. You have just created the requirements documentation after meeting with the stakeholders and studying the project charter. This requirements documentation can be used in developing A. Project scope statement. B. The WBS. C. The work performing information. D. The project scope statement and the WBS. 14. What document is the result of the integration of the management knowledge area with the project planning process group? A. Business case. B. Project charter. C. Project benefit management plan. D. Project management plan. 15. Which of the following are the input documents for the develop project management plan process? A. Project charter. B. Quality management plan. C. Scope baseline. D. Resource management plan.